Could you tell me about where you were born?
I was born in a small town called Mattoon in Wisconsin. It's about the same size as Alberta.
Um, who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My mother was Joyce Shifley, and she was a librarian for about 33 years. And my father is Paul Reichert, and he was a law enforcement officer for about the same.
Um, did you have any siblings? What were their names and genders?
I do. I have an older sister and two older brothers. My sister is Kelly, and my brothers are Steve and Larry.
You mentioned your father was in the police force. Did that inspire you to join the military?
No, he was actually in the Army, so I decided to join the military, but I joined the Air Force, and then I followed in his footsteps in law enforcement as well.
What did your family think about you joining the service?
I think everybody was proud and happy about it with the exception of my mother. She didn't care for her youngest and daughter joining the service.
What schooling did you attend?
Through the military, I attended air traffic control, and so I did that my entire time in service.
Did you hold any jobs before entering the service?
Just some remedial work. I used to babysit and work at a local restaurant, but I actually joined the service while I was still in high school.
Can you tell us about when you went into the military? Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I actually enlisted. The draft was not happening during that time, and as a woman, I wouldn't have been drafted. So I decided that college wasn't for me right away. So I thought, what better way to be taken care of and have all my meals paid for and a place to sleep? Join the military.
You said that college wasn't for you at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you joined the military? Why did you feel that way?
I personally had nowhere to come home to if I was in college at the time. I was actually offered a scholarship to go to St. Norbert's for a teaching degree. Hindsight's 2020. But there was not room for me left at our family home in regards to being able to come back for summers or anything like that.
What did you leave behind when you left to serve? Friends, family?
Absolutely. It was every family function, every event, every milestone that anybody had. I was a really involved aunt, and I left behind all my young nieces and nephews. I was fortunate enough to be able to come home often, but that still changed it because I was one of their primary caregivers when they were growing up.
Did you ever get homesick while in the military?
I think I was homesick in the beginning, like during basic training, because that's the biggest change and the hardest. And then I got homesick right at the end of my time serving. My mom fell really ill, and that, drew me back home.
What is your most vivid memory of your time training or in school?
In training, my air traffic control school was very difficult, and I was always amazed and enamored that they would allow an 18-year-old to do it. Giant airplanes flying through the air, and I'm telling them all where to go. And in some respects, the people who had been in the service, I was training some of them to get their in-service for air traffic control.
Why were you interested in the Air Force over the other branches of the military?
Well, I get motion sickness, so I knew I couldn't do Navy. Marines was a little too intense for my personality, and my father recommended the Air Force because he said and agreed with their statement of work smarter, not harder.
Does any particular instructor stand out in your mind or that you remember clearly?
I clearly remember my TI, Bear, and her name described her perfectly. Um, and we must have been a group of hooligans that went through together because, boy, she was so mad at us, even during our group photo, that she wouldn't even stand face on in the photo, that she had to go sideways and just kind of peek around the corner. But it was all in good fun.
What was your first assignment after basic training?
So after basic, the Air Force Basic is in San Antonio. I was stationed in Biloxi, Mississippi. That was for tech school.
Did you receive any special ed training?
Well, the air traffic control training, and then, of course, weapons, marksman training, and also how to drive all the specialty vehicles in case you were in wartime and having to drive a bus or the jeeps and everything like that.
Do you have a favorite out of those training?
I had a blast, and it's probably because I was in the Air Force during survival training. I grew up camping, and it was reenactment camping, so it felt very familiar to me, and it came easier to me than most.
Did you receive any promotions, and could you tell me about them?
I received, well, you started at airman, and then you go to airman first class, and then senior airman. And if you are providing honorable service, those are just granted to you, kind of like a regular job promotion. I did receive the humanitarian award for efforts while I was in every base that I was at. Had a natural disaster while I stayed there. So I don't know if it was me or just the times, but hopefully it wasn't me.
What was the hardest part of the military lifestyle for you to adapt to? Why do you think it was?
The hardest part for me was, well, kind of what I just mentioned. It almost felt like a regular job, being in the branch that I was in and being in the job that I was in. The hardest part was when we had the natural disasters, because you weren't doing your job then. You know, you had your M16 and you were out either monitoring the streets, or at one point in Mississippi there was a hurricane, and if you were small enough you got shoved down in the manholes and you were pulling out branches, or you were providing aid to citizens. When I was in at my next base, the whole town flooded and then started on fire, so the whole community was on our base and providing those type of efforts.
Yeah, a lot of time during natural disasters, communities will come together. Did that teach you a lot about community and teamwork?
Absolutely. It was really fantastic. I was serving with a really great group of people. We were the group that were always doing the Special Olympics and Winterfest for the community, or helping with the air show and things like that. Yeah, it was amazing.
Does that translate to your experience here in Benzie County?
Absolutely. I have seen some really great work, even just in the school system, or if you look at the volunteer efforts at Bacon, or if you look at the Historical Society, the Baby Pantry, it's just phenomenal. You could see that really translating. And a lot of people in the area are veterans, so they're still continuing on that service, and that's wonderful to see.
I'm going to ask you some questions about your wartime service,
Okay.
including where did you serve?
Well, after tech school, I was fortunate enough to remain stateside for the entirety of my service. So I was in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And towards the end, I was put on what's called stop loss. So you have your regular amount of time served, and then you can choose to extend or get out. They chose to extend me because we were in not technically a war, but Kosovo action. So in case they had to send our unit overseas, so they just held us in the service longer.
I've read about the Kosovo action in preparation, and there were some damaged aircraft, and on your information sheet you did say that you were injured. Did you lose anybody special in your unit or anybody that impacted your life over in Kosovo?
I was fortunate enough not to lose anybody in Kosovo that was special to me. Primarily during that time, everyone from our air base was sent to Saudi Arabia. And there are some instances where we didn't lose anyone due to action, but rather to things like PTSD and them having to deal with the stresses of that when they got home, and some of them took their own life.
What were your experiences in Kosovo? How do you remember?
I was not in Kosovo. I was in Grand Forks the whole time. I served during the Kosovo action time.
Do you recall any particularly humorous or unusual events that went on around your base?
Let me try to think of an appropriate one for a video. Well, they had integrated dorms, and that was male and female dorms. And so there was one gentleman who would go on tour, and he felt that he didn't have to lock his dorm or anything like that. And of course, we were all friends and always got along. But we kept telling him one day that's not going to be a safe choice. So we decided to take everything out of his dorm. And when he came home, he was a little stunned, and we all had many years of good laughs over that.
You're talking about your friends you made on the base. Are you still in contact with them today?
I am. A lot of us do, of course, Facebook, and there are groups specifically for just our time or people that were just at that base as well.
Speaking of contact, while you're at the base, how did you stay in touch with family and friends?
Primarily it was phone calls. When I was in basic training, we did a lot of letters. You think once a week you're allowed one phone call in basic. So that was primarily letters. But afterwards it was normal. And Grand Forks was actually only an 8-hour drive from my hometown. So on a long weekend, if we really pushed it, we could head home for the weekend.
What did you do for recreation on the base or when you were off duty?
We were fortunate enough to be at a base that had a lot of camping and water sports and things like that. I know in that area one of the favorite activities was tubing down the Red River, which is ironically the same river that flooded the entire area.
Did you ever go on one of those trips, and how was your experience living there?
Yes, I did. I tell you, I grew up in Wisconsin, born and raised, and I thought that I knew winter. I was wrong. And when I was flying into Grand Forks, I leaned over to the person sitting next to me, and I said, "When are we going to break through the clouds?" And she said, "Oh, honey, that ain't clouds. That's snow." You could not even see any buildings because there weren't any. It was all snow. And there was one point when they were plowing, they would close the highway when it was too deep and too windy to plow. And there was one point when you would be driving down the highway and they finally got the roads clear, that it was just a wall of snow and a wall of snow. And you hoped that they plowed in the right place.
On the base, did you guys have any good luck charms or sayings?
I'm going to refrain from that one. It probably was not appropriate. So yes.
mentioned one of the honors slash medals that you received for your service. What were some other ones that you received?
Oh, you're going to test my memory. I gave you the cheat sheet over there. You'll have to refresh my memory.
You received Community Ambassador. You were also a Morale and Welfare Representation for your squadron. And you had an Outstanding Unit Award. Could you tell me about your interactions with your units and how you received those awards?
Well, the Morale and Welfare Representative was started before I got there, and myself and a couple of other people just decided to expand that. We saw a need because it can be such a ice desert in the winter and there's no in or out. We tried to ensure that there were always activities, especially for the new people coming in, that they had a contact person and somewhere they could go on a special day for them, whether it was a holiday that they celebrated or a birthday, or if they were struggling, we made sure that they had contact with someone when they got there. That was their person. And actually those relationships usually blossomed into good friendships. And actually I think one of them ended up in a marriage, so it worked. And as far as our outstanding unit, we received that after the flood and fire that happened, because everybody really did pull together, whether you were working in what we called Sandbag Central, filling sandbags to help save homes, help prevent more flooding and damage, or if you were walking the dikes that we had built to prevent vandalism or to report any more infrastructure problems, and then also maintaining the health and safety of the community members that we had to house on the base during that time. Because what ended up happening is we had to house a lot of them in what we called Tent City because there was no more housing available. So they all had to live in tents, and so that can be a big change for someone who just lost everything. So that was an important part of that award, I think.
Out of all the natural disasters you experienced during your service, which one was the worst?
Oh, definitely the flood, and you know how devastating a hurricane can be. So that was devastating, and it was like nothing I had ever seen growing up in Wisconsin. But the flood, it was just like nothing I've ever seen either. As you were driving downtown, you could see the water was literally rising around you, and buildings were bursting into flame. I don't think I would ever see anything like that again in my lifetime. That really sticks out in my mind's eye.
How did you feel when you ended your service?
Part of me felt sad. You know, you're leaving behind a huge sense of camaraderie and a huge part of who you were, because joining at such a young age, you know, that's, you know, the rest of your teenage years and into your mid-20s, that's a big part of growth in anybody's life. So that was sad, but I was also happy to move on to the next part of my life. So mixed emotions, definitely.
Do you remember the day you ended your service, and how long in total did you serve?
I served 4 years active and then 4 inactive, so they could call us back at any time. And it was very strange because it was July of 2000, July 1st was my last day. And things keep going. I mean, I trained my replacement, and even though we had great memories and everybody still keeps in contact and it was wonderful, they had to replace the cog in the wheel, and things keep going. So that was mixed too, I think.
Did you return? Where did you go? Did you return home?
I did. I was engaged to be married at the time, and we decided to move to Appleton, Wisconsin to be closer to my family.
How were you received by your family and your community?
Oh, very well. Having military service was a huge benefit for any career choice that I was making, and I stayed in the Appleton area for, I think, 20 years afterwards. We made some really great connections there. It was a wonderful experience.
How did you readjust to civilian life? Did you work, or what job did you take up?
I did work. I decided to join law enforcement at that time, and I became a 911 center supervisor. And I had done one or two different jobs in between that time, but I found that I really thrived in a structured environment, and law enforcement gave me that paramilitary feel that I thrived in.
How did your service change you?
I would have to say that joining the military was one of the best decisions that I ever made. It really shaped some foundational relationships that I have, and it, I think, has made me be able to focus on humanitarian efforts and community, like you had mentioned earlier. And I found that that is a really big part of who I am. I continued that on even after leaving the service.
Just a few seconds ago, now that I'm thinking about it, you were talking about your job as a 911 operator.
Mm-hmm.
I personally know that that takes a lot of training and not a lot of people make it through that program. Did your experience with aircraft and working as an aircraft controlman help you with that experience?
Oh, absolutely. It was all of the same language that we were using. It was all radio control. I found it was less stressful. I know that that sounds backwards, but I wasn't in charge of something falling out of the sky anymore. I just had to tell somebody where to go and they went. Okay. So I found it easier, and I think that really benefited me and really helped me to excel. I had a wonderful career in law enforcement, and I think a huge part of that is thanks to my service.
Did you join a veteran organization after your service?
I did not.
Do you attend any reunions for veterans in the community?
No. As not being from this area, there aren't any veterans here that I served with. So I would have to travel.
How did service affect the way you relate to people? And if it did, how so?
It did. I think I was probably always an upfront and direct person, but at such a young age, you don't know that. And that really helped to bring that out in me. And so sometimes I struggle with understanding people who take a long route to tell the same story, and they're adding wonderful color and communication to it. And because I can't understand that type of communication as easily, I sometimes have a harder time with that. But we're learning the rest of our lives, right?
If you were to give any life lessons based off what you learned from your military experience, what would they be?
Do it. Join the military. Best choice I ever made in my life. It was the best choice financially. It was the best choice educational-wise. It was the best choice relationship-wise. And I think it was a really great experience. If you have an opportunity to go to school, you could still join the military afterwards.
How has your military service impacted your feelings about war and the military in general?
My feelings about war, I think, are mixed. In my younger days, you know, you're influenced by your parents and the people around you. I was very stout and no room for movement or fluidity as a conservative Republican, I would say. And that was influenced greatly by the military and how I thought of war then. As you age and as you mature and you learn things and you communicate with different people, I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum now, ironically, and have stronger feelings about that because I look at it from a parent's point of view. I look at it as a point of view of, do we really need to be there? Maybe the war at home is helping our communities rather than other communities. And I'm sorry, that was a two-part question. I answered maybe war. What was the other part?
And your feelings about the military in general?
I don't think that has changed because it afforded me an opportunity to learn, and also they left room for growth, to see where the military stance on even humanitarian or personal choices of people has changed in just the last 2 decades has actually been pretty phenomenal. There's a long way to go, but you can see some effort and movement there.
We flew through these questions. Is there anything you've always wanted to share about your service or your experience that you never have?
I don't think so. I think that if somebody asked me, I've always been willing to share. I am a disabled veteran, and that is due to some personal trauma while I was in the military. I think if I could go back and say to anybody else who might be going through something like that, say something if you have the strength to do so right away, so that you don't have to fight those battles later in life. Maybe that's what it would be.
What would you like people to know or remember about your story?
I think I'd like people to remember that it's a story of growth, and that even though the military seems structured, and it seems regimented, that there is room for growth there too. So don't automatically leave it out as an option.
Lastly, what do you wish more people knew about veterans?
I wish more people knew that it was a struggle. I think we see the heartfelt stories of recovery and all the wonderful work that is done for veterans. But there's still a huge, huge problem with affected veterans who are homeless, and the multitude of reasons that that is the case. And I would hope that people would look at that and say, there must be more going on, and there must be more that we can do. And it's not just about serving in wartime. It's not just about going overseas, because for so many years it was a closed classroom. There wasn't a great format for people to stand up and say this is wrong without having their life destroyed. And I think once they got out, it destroyed those people personally. I think that would be what I'd like to see changed, and what I think people should really look to if they wanted to help.
Program you mentioned?
So it's a first flight program, and it's where students from age, I believe it's 7 or 8 to 18, can sign up, and you'll be awarded, and it's all a free program, your first training flight right through Traverse City. and you'll get to go up and log your first hours, and they can tell you about all the different types of programs, and you get a full lesson on the aircraft, and you actually get to fly it. So if that's something that you're interested in further in the Air Force, I would start there. After the interview is over, I'll look in my phone and get you the name and phone number of the gentleman who does that program. My son, who is 8 years old, is actually going to be starting that program. So I think that'd be an even better way for you to say, oh, flying is for me, or no, it's not.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Could you tell me a little bit more about some of the other natural disasters that occurred during your service?
Absolutely. So every base that I was stationed at actually had a natural disaster while I was there, as I mentioned. So when I was in basic training in San Antonio, Texas, this was in the summer of 1996. It was one of the worst droughts that they had ever had, and they had what we called Black Flag days, that it was so hot and it was so intense that people were not even allowed outdoors. So it was kind of like the pandemic right now. Unless you were an essential worker, you were not allowed to go out. So I spent a lot of my basic training ironing folds and creases into my underwear, if you can believe that. You have to fold and iron your underwear and get the lines perfectly straight with the tweezers. Wonderful to know, isn't it? And then when I was stationed in Biloxi, Mississippi, and we had the hurricane there. That was in the fall of 96. And the hurricane was so devastating all along the Gulf because casinos aren't legal unless they're on water in that area. It actually picked up the casinos out of the ocean, out of the Gulf of Mexico, and they landed on the major thoroughway. And that is one of the projects that we helped clean up on. And then I mentioned too that they would send us down into the sewers, and we'd be hauling out all the tree branches and things like that you could, because you had to pull them back up out the opposite way that they came in. And there was no way to push them further along. And so that was an experience, obviously, like I had never had before. And the hurricane cleanup actually extended my stay at that base as well, because not only were we doing the natural cleanup, it was all of the city was destroyed as well. So we were taking care of that. We were fortunate enough to not have to house too many civilians because our base was actually quite affected by the hurricanes as well. Several of the dorms flooded, but that's a major flying base, so they were able to right away have essentials. It was a C-130 base, I think. So they were able to fly in essentials in and out and get them to the people right there, right away. And then, as I mentioned, the natural disaster in Grand Forks, North Dakota with the Red River flooding. And, you know, I haven't checked in recent years, but I'm hoping that they have a little bit better system in place, because I know right after I was leaving there, they still had major flooding the next couple of years, but nothing has come close to what it was at that point. Like I had mentioned, when you would go downtown and you could see the water rising up and the buildings starting on fire, we actually ended up having to go out on a rescue mission to get one of our airmen who was trapped in an apartment building. It was about 15 stories high, and his whole block was flooded. And as soon as we got him out of there, it was one of his building was one of the ones that started on fire as well. And I'll tell you, that was an experience. He had a cat, and as soon as the building started on fire, he decided he was going to go back in the building with his cat. We talked him out of that, but we did end up saving the cat, whose name was Charlie. So that was an experience. And while it wasn't a wartime and I did not serve overseas in the war, it felt like it, because when we were walking the dikes to make sure there were no breaches in the infrastructure and no vandalism, we were equipped to the nines. We had flat vests on, we had our M16s, because there was looting and there was vandalism, and there was also a lot of assaults happening at that time. It was just a lot of chaos, as you could imagine, anything like that happening. So we were part of that recovery system as well.
If you were to give any advice to the younger generation, other than the advice you gave earlier about just joining the military, what would it be?
It would definitely be follow your dreams. Don't do what you think others would want you to do. Don't do what you think society wants you to do. Think about it. Trust your instincts. Trust yourself. It sounds cliche. There's no one else out there that is exactly like you. And the things that you can accomplish and the greatness that can come out of one person's hands is amazing if they don't tie their own hands by trying to conform to someone else's expectations. Expectations can ruin a life of personal achievements. You know, it's not about making yourself fit into this cookie cutter, or even using the labels that we put on, let's say, millennials. That's a big one right now, right? You don't have to be like that. You might have some tendencies, but you don't have to follow the stereotypes. And do yourself a favor. And if somebody wants to tell you something, be gracious and then walk your own path.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
This has been a great interview.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. It was nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too.